going to be going through sort of how to connect to Salesforce. It's one of the questions we get pretty regularly, and there are a couple of tips and tricks, as well as several features that are useful, and we'll go through all of that. So we'll first sort of talk through how the connection to Salesforce works, some of the tricks that we've learned so that it's straightforward for you guys to leverage the functionality, and then I'll go through some of the additional features like insert, update, and delete so that you can actually manage the data in your Salesforce implementation easily and effectively. The final thing I'll just quickly touch on is the broader sort of architecture and services layer that is working as I'm interacting with Salesforce and Pentaho. So without further ado, I'm just going to get straight into the demonstration. This is going to be a demonstration of tools, not any kind of presentation stuff. So this is the Pentaho Data Integration graphical design tool. Like I was saying before, what we built here is actually precisely what is deployed. This is when I save this file, it's saving an XML document in the background that is read by the Pentaho Data Integration engine and executed at runtime. So there's no separate compilation step. So on the canvas, we see a series of 4 steps. Basically what's happening is it's set up to get my Salesforce data. I've put in a little test step, and then I'm writing it out as a text file to my desktop, as well as a serialized file to the desktop as well. So the way that happens is on the left-hand side, on the Design tab, we can type up at the top and see all of the different things that are related to Salesforce. So these 5 steps are the different steps that you can use to interact with the Salesforce API. So to grab the data or to start it, I just drag it onto the canvas, which I've already done here. That's this step. It's exactly the same. This little green check mark means that the last time I ran it, it ran successfully. So these 2 steps are exactly the same. So I'm going to delete this one. Yes, I'm sure I want to delete it. And now I'm going to go into the Salesforce input step. Now this Salesforce input step is very similar to table input. If you're familiar with Pentaho Data Integration, the table input step is basically the step that you use to get data out of a SQL database. This step roughly matches that step. So what we see here is the Salesforce web service URL, my username, and a very long password. So in terms of connecting to Salesforce, there's a trick in the Salesforce web service URL and a trick in the password. Now, if you're an experienced Salesforce developer, these things are probably pretty obvious, but oftentimes those of us who are tasked with interacting or building data or doing analysis don't know the tips and tricks necessary to connect to different web services that exist out there. So Salesforce over time has implemented 24, and actually I think there's probably more now, different versions of their web service API. And that's what this 24.0 number at the end of the URL indicates. It says to the Salesforce web service, use the version 24 API. Now, in order for the Pentaho Data Integration tool to work, it has embedded inside of it the Salesforce jars so that it knows how to talk to the Salesforce web service API. So when you're building your ETL transformations, you need to be sure that that the jar that's in your ETL implementation matches that web service URL. So I've just gone into the libx directory, and I now see that the Salesforce partner jar that's in the Salesforce directory is the 24th version, 24.0, and that matches the web service URL that I have listed here. So that's the first trick. So when Pentaho first came out with the Salesforce integration, it came out with the 10.0 version of the Salesforce API, and so people who built their connections with version 10 had difficulty as the tools upgraded. So that's just something to be aware of, just that there's a synchronization between the API you're using and the API you're calling. Okay? The second thing that's a bit of a trick for newbies in connecting to Salesforce is the addition of my token to the URL. So I've just hovered over the password field, and it gave instructions around this. And basically, if we said the password is just the word password, for example, you then need to add your personal security token after your password in order to connect to Salesforce. So I'll just quickly show you where you can get that set in the Salesforce developer website. So we'll just go over here, and so I've logged in as a developer into salesforce.com, and over on the left hand side we see my personal information, and there's an option here which is reset my security token. And if I click that button, I'm not going to because it will break everything, Salesforce will send me an email with a new security token. Additionally, if you need to reset your password or change your password, they will also send you an updated token. The other way, so if that's not something that, for whatever reason with your implementation, is a viable option, you can also enable Salesforce to recognize your IP address or domain so that you don't need to add this security token. Basically, this security token is designed for letting you interact from a non-named environment. So the next thing I'll just quickly show is the email that you get. Maybe I won't. Looks like I've closed it. Yeah, I don't have it. Basically, it's basically a long alphanumeric string, about that long, that you place after your password. So the next thing we'll do is we'll test the connection, just make sure we're connected to Salesforce. Okay. So it says the connection's okay. I'm connected to Salesforce with username, my username. Okay. The other thing that happens when we do that test connection button is it goes out to the API and it asks, what modules does the user Zachary Zeus have access to? So these are all the modules that my role has access to that I can then interact with and ask for data back. And then I can specify a query if I want to do something more advanced. I'm not going to do that. I'm basically just going to select the module account, preview rows, Now, one of the things you'll notice is that this isn't the fastest thing in the world. Now, what's happening behind the scenes is the Pentaho Data Integration tool is calling the Salesforce Web Service API, and so the speed here is directly related to how quickly Salesforce is responding to that web service request. So that delay between when I clicked preview and when the data showed up was as a direct result of the Salesforce API taking time to answer the question. So we can see that I have 14 accounts in my Salesforce implementation. If I scroll left, I can see all of the data that exists there. I'm going to click close, click OK, because I'm not going to do anything else here. Click OK. The next thing I can do is I can preview on the next step. I just have that test me step, and I'll see that same 14 rows. Now I like to have these dummy steps in the middle of my transformations as a way of knowing where appropriate breakpoints are for me to do testing. There's basically no overhead with using those. They literally do exactly what they say. So I can see that I have all the data. And then the final thing that I'm doing is I'm writing the data out to the desktop so that I can potentially use it in a downstream transformation. So I've chosen two methods to write out. You'll see these little gray icons over the hop. And what those icons mean is that I'm copying the data to both steps. So we see down here in the step metrics grid that the test me step is read 14 records, but it's written 28. And basically it's duplicated the data out to both outputs so that I get the full data set in both locations. One of the things you can do is rather than copy it, you can choose distribute data to next steps. So this is good if you need to launch multiple threads or do some parallelization or out to separate nodes. So this is sort of how we manage handling bigger and bigger data sets and building through constraints. So I'm now going to just click run and launch, and I'm going to save the transformation. And again, down here in the step metrics grid, in a couple of seconds, we'll see that it was effectively written out. Now, this one, which writes the text file, has 15 records output, and this one has 14. And the main difference between these two is the text file output has a header record, and that header record is that extra row, so that when you load it into an Excel spreadsheet or something like that, you have the column headings. And this step basically embeds that metadata in with the data so you don't have that extra header row. This one is very good for building portable jobs where you're writing interim files. Okay. So that's this step. And down here, so one of the things that I've done in this transformation, just from a documentation and a visualization perspective, is written in the name of the step, precisely what it's doing. And I've done that with all of the steps. And then written some notes about what's going on so that if somebody else picks up this transformation or needs to do additional development, they can quickly understand what's going on. They know the tips or tricks that might be going on here, and so that it's very transportable and very easy for people to use. So now I'm going to go to the next part of this, where I'm going to demonstrate inserting new records into my Salesforce implementation. Okay, so I'm getting data from that file I've just written. I'll go quickly show you that. So I've just created that on my desktop file.q. This is hard coded at this point for this demo, but anywhere you see this dollar inside the gray diamond, there's the ability to parameterize that field. So we could easily make this a highly parameterized and portable. I've just done this for simplicity's sake. So now if we go look at the desktop, we see the file.cube file and the file.txt that actually just got written as part of this process. So moving on to the next one, I'm getting that same output, and I'm going to, this insert new records has the same connection details. I'm writing to account, but I haven't defined the account ID in the fields that I'm updating. So what it's going to do is it's basically going to read the data and think, oh, these are new accounts, and it's going to write them. So I'm just going to click run. And we're going to see that it's written 14 records out to the out to Salesforce. And we'll take a quick look and here. And if I click preview rows again, we see that we've gone from the 14 that we had originally out to 28. And the other thing we'll notice is most of the data is not updated. And I'll show you why that happened next. So coming back to this one that just ran that created those extra 14 records inside of Salesforce. Because I only have the ownership and account name defined to update, that means only those fields got updated inside of Salesforce. Moving on to the next thing is a very similar process, except I'm going to update the records that I've just read. And so I'm going to click. So basically, again, getting that same data from my desktop where it says file.q. We see a test me step, so I'm going to just preview that. And we see the 14 records again in the test me step that we ran when we first put this together. Click close. And this has already gone ahead and updated those 14 records. And the difference between the insert and the update one is I did include that ID and account ID field so they could match the records and update those fields. Now, I've just updated the data with exactly the same data for demonstration purposes, but you can sort of see how that would work. So if we had a transformation or reread the data and manipulated it or changed it, we could then update that directly in Salesforce. Okay? So now I'm just going to quickly go back to my Salesforce web console and look at the accounts. And I'm going to view all accounts, click go. And we see 28 of the records, exactly the way we talked about. And we see that all of the account names are duplicated. So it's very obvious that this stuff has updated. So the next thing I'm going to show is cleaning up that mess, because clearly I don't want to keep duplicated records around. So I'm going to read all of the data from the accounts section. I'm going to then get rid of all of the ones that have been created after July 31st, 2012. And I'm going to send them to the Salesforce delete step and send the ones that I don't want to delete to this less than 2012 step and do nothing with them. So just for the demonstration purposes, while we're sort of walking through how this all works, I'm going to disable the delete step and use that at the end. The way I did that is I just clicked on the hop, and that disables it. You can also right-click on the hop, and you can flip the direction, disable the hop, delete the hop, or do a bulk change where I can disable all the hops upstream, downstream from that hop. So there's a number of different options that I can employ there, but by far the easiest is just clicking on it. So the get all data from account section, I can preview the rows there. I'll see again those 28 that I just saw on the web page. Including all the ones that I've just added with no data. And the key thing here is that if we scroll all the way to the right, we see the created date of 2012-08-01 at apparently 8:40, whatever, whatever local time this is. And we're going to get rid of all of the ones that are greater than July 31st. Okay. So I have another test me step just so that I can do that preview that I've just done. And then in the filter rows section, so this step, I'll just show you where I got that, how I found it. I just type filter here, and this is the step that I've dragged onto the canvas and then changed its name so that when I look at it, it doesn't just tell me it's filtering rows, it tells me exactly what kind of filter rows, what I'm filtering on. So that if anybody then picks this up after me, they're able to effectively figure out what's going on without trying to debug the specific code that sits inside that filter step. The other thing I did, just for, again, simplicity purposes, is added these two dummy steps and named them after the business rule that I'm implementing inside the filter rows. So it's obvious that if I'm filtering on rows that are after July 2012, the true results coming out of this step should go to the dummy step that says greater than July 2012, and the false ones should go to less than July 2012. So if we look at the filter rows, we see how to implement that. So we see that we're sending true data to greater than 2012 and false data to less than 2012. So that's where that green and red icon on the hops came from, based on this true false step here. And then the condition here is I picked which field I want to do an analysis on. So I selected created date, and I did greater than, but here are the different expressions that we have available to us. And then I chose, then I entered, so actually let me cancel that. I have the option of either picking another field, so I could say is greater than another field that exists in the stream, or I can do it as a constant. So I chose as a constant. I picked a type value of date. I put in the value that I was looking for, and then I did the conversion format. So if I wanted to do after a very precise time, I could have the conversion format include the hours, the minutes, and the seconds, and just type that in manually here if that's what I wanted to do. I can then test, and I see that the resulting value is a date of 2012 and July 31st. Click OK. And then I can quickly preview this data and see that for the ones that are less than July 2012, I then get my original 14 records that we were looking at the very beginning, and we see that 14 also went to the greater than July 2012. So then we launch the Salesforce delete step. Again, I have my same credentials put into here, and the field name ID is that account ID, so that it will take the account ID from each of the rows in this step, go look at Salesforce, and if they exist, they will then delete them. So I'm going to click run, launch and save. And we'll see down here that there are 14 records that are then deleted. So we see that it's output 14 records, and basically that means it's executed that delete against those 14 records. Okay, so now let's go back into Salesforce. Let's hit refresh up here. And now we should see just the 14 records that we have left. So that's pretty much the demo of how to use the Salesforce web service tools in the Pentaho Data Integration platform.